Welcome everybody. My name is Anna Burley. I am the Policy Officer for the Co-operative Party. To those of you who have been loitering for a few minutes, sorry that you've had to hang around just until 1 o'clock so that we don't miss anybody out when we start. This is, I think it's our 7th or 8th cooperation live on a Wednesday lunchtime, and there are lots of familiar faces as well as some new attendees that I've not met before, so welcome. Apologies if you have heard my spiel before, but we record these meetings. It enables us to put them on YouTube afterwards for anybody who can't join us live but does want to catch up on the conversation. So if you do not want to be recorded, then please turn off your video. There is a button at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen that will enable you to do that. Broadly, your video won't show up on the YouTube unless you're the speaker, so there's not too much worry, but we want to make sure that everyone's happy and comfortable, and if you're asking a question later, your face will be on the video if you've chosen to turn your video on. Speaking of asking questions, I will have you all on mute for the duration of the call. It helps us avoid background noise from 50 different houses across the country and make sure that we can hear our speakers really clearly. There will be time for questions and answers afterwards, and I will unmute you when it comes to that so that you're able to ask your question uninterrupted. To ask a question, you can use the participate button. It should be at the bottom of your screen, and what it does is in the top corner of your video, it puts a little blue hands up like this. I can see that you'd like to ask a question, and then we'll take them in 2s or 3s, and I'll take as many as we've got time for, but apologies if we don't get onto all of them. There is also a chat function, so if you want to ask a question and you want to, I don't know, send me the topic in advance, or you'd like me to ask it for you, you can use the chat function again at the bottom of your screen. It goes to myself or my colleague Izzy, who is the Co-op Party account with a purple B, and we'll be able to read it, and I'll include those in the list of people that I'm asking to speak. I think that is my main housekeeping. Obviously, any issues, stick it in the chat, and please keep yourself muted. So without further ado, I will introduce our conversation. We've still got a few more joining, but I'll keep going, and they'll be able to pick up as they come in. So this will be looking at fair trade, and more widely around some of the issues that producers and farmers around the world, and particularly in the global south, are facing during coronavirus, what that means in the short term in the ways that we want to protect them, how we need to get the government and hold them to account on our international development duties during this crisis, but also what is it that we want to rebuild once sort of coronavirus crisis is starting to diminish and we've got a handle on the pandemic. And I know that Alice is thinking about things like sustainable and resilient supply chains, looking at our international development budget. So all of those issues I hope we can sort of touch on either during speeches, but no pressure if they're not things you were planning to raise. I'm sure they'll come up in questions afterwards. So I will hand over to Alice first. Alice is joining us from the Fairtrade Foundation, where she's the Policy and Campaigns Manager. Is that right, Alice? I will just unmute you. There we go. So Alice is going to give us a bit of context, and then I'll hand over to Preet, who'll talk a bit about her recent promotion to Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, although she's obviously been in that shadow team for a little while now, and some of her priorities in that role, and particularly sort of perhaps looking at some of the fair trade issues as well as the wider international development agenda. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Anna. Well, firstly, can I just say it is a pleasure to be speaking with everyone today, despite the very strange circumstances that we continue to find ourselves in. And also, can I just say it is a pleasure to be speaking on the same panel as the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development. I'm looking forward to the presentation later on in the call. So as Anna mentioned, I'm going to talk today about the impact that we're seeing on fair trade producers that we work with in the global south, and immediate response to meet the immediate needs for the crisis on building back better. And I don't need them as I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the work that we do. But just briefly, we are a part of the global fair trade system, and we currently support 1.71 million fair trade workers in 73 countries around the world. So what has meant that as the crisis has continued to develop, we've been able to coordinate information flows between the producer networks in the Global South, Fairtrade International, and some of the member organisations in different nation states. So that's meant that we've been able to really gather a regular flow of information and really begin to understand what's happening on the ground and the reality that's facing producers. And I think, unsurprisingly, the impact of the pandemic that we've seen so far on farmers and workers has been huge. It's been very rapid, and it's a constantly evolving situation as well that we're continuing to monitor. There are several sort of key areas of concern that we're seeing at the moment. And the first of these, and unsurprisingly, is the health impacts associated with the spread of the virus. Many of the communities that we work with are already living with very inadequate healthcare systems, a lack of safe water and sanitation, and are at risk of hunger and malnutrition. And the other key area, and I think this is perhaps an issue that's maybe receiving less attention, but also in need of urgent support, is the large-scale loss of livelihoods and risk of unemployment that we're seeing throughout the Global South, and that's continuing to spread. We know already that farmers and workers are among the world's poorest people, and they live in communities with non-existent or very weak social safety nets. So, for example, I'm sure many of you will have heard that the flour industry has been very, very badly. For example, in Kenya, which is a key, the estimates are that there are about 50,000 workers that have been sent home with no pay. So that is a huge scale of job loss that we're seeing, and urgent support is really needed there. So what have we done at Fairtrade? So one of the things that we did immediately as the crisis developed was that we made a temporary change to their trade standards. So we gave producer groups some additional flexibility to use the premium throughout the crisis. So what this means is that additional sum of money which producers have, which usually goes into communal funds that they can use however they wish. What we're seeing is that producers are using that premium fund in order to meet COVID related needs. And that includes public health measures and social protection. To give a few examples, a Fairtrade flour farm in Kenya is using the premium to manufacture masks for workers and families in the community. And those workers that would otherwise been sent home on unpaid leave, so they've been able to retain some employment and develop tailored universities and churches to set up a diagnostic centre. And that's been using some of the premium funds as well. So what's 10 to 15% of the UK's overseas food imports come from developing countries. And so for fair trade, what we're saying is that supporting farmers and workers now and in recovery is going to be vital, not only for protecting the livelihoods and lives of thousands, but also in supporting UK food security and resilience in the long term, and also global economic recovery. In the short, immediate term, we're keen to see a government response which includes urgent measures strengthening healthcare services and providing PPE. But also, as I mentioned, there is an urgent need for the provision of support to protect livelihoods and jobs, and also social protection to mitigate against the worsening of widespread poverty in the community. Sort of finally, final point, and how we can, what's clear, I think, is that the crisis reveals the inequality which often underlies our global economy, including the fragility of trade and food systems, transport systems, and public health systems. And so I think it's really important that we see a response with governments, business and civil society building back better with a more resilient, sustainable and fair approach in place. And of course, there are a number of things that will include. I've just seen a comment that I'm breaking up it quite a bit. Anna, can people hear me, or is it very difficult?
Occasionally it goes, you turn into a bit of a robot, but I think broadly the gist has come across, and there's not a lot we can do about your bandwidth. You can try turning your video off, but I think we got most of it. And I was going to let people know that obviously you've written us a fabulous blog post that covers some of this, so we will be able to circulate the details written down afterwards for anyone who's missed parts or anything.
Okay, well, what I'll do is I'll just turn off my video, and I'll just speak briefly on those final sort of building back better points, and turn my video on for the Q&A. So sorry about my bandwidth, everyone. So I just wanted to just end very quickly on this sort of building back better idea and this approach, and really what we'd like to see in building back better is, an investment in sustainable livelihoods. So that includes the payment of living wages and living incomes, a renewed commitment to responsible business practice and human rights. And here in the UK, we're very keen to see the introduction of mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. Clearly as well, and I think this is really important to always bear in mind in these conversations, that any restart to the economy needs to accelerate action on the climate emergency. So we're very keen for that to be a key part of the policy response. And finally, there does need to be a renewed commitment to fair and sustainable trade policy, which underpins a lot of the issues that we're now seeing. And I think with these measures in place, that means that we may be better able to face future shocks, including climate-related risks or the risk of a future pandemic. And I think we are seeing that there are, that we may be seeing that communities that have benefited from that investment have been better able to meet the public health needs arising from this virus. So, as I mentioned, Fairtrade farmers have been able to use those premium funds to set in place health and social protection measures, which have to some extent buffered the immediate impact of the virus. And just, very quickly, we have also seen that a lot of the businesses that we work with at Fairtrade who have been very quick to see the need to support vulnerable producers and set those supportive measures in place. And I think, all of this together adds evidence really to the business and as well as, a very obvious moral case for investment in fair and sustainable supply chains. I will stop there because I know that we're sort of short on time, but I'm very happy to answer any other questions in the Q&A later. So thank you very much.
Fabulous, thank you, Alice. And I'm gonna unmute Preet and hand straight over, or you might have to unmute yourself, Preet. It's I think you might have. Lovely, there we go. So handing straight over to you to either pick up on anything Alice said or anything that you wanted to be able to share.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you, Anna, and to the Co-operative Party and everyone who's joined the call today. It's wonderful to see so many people take an interest in international development. And of course, it's an absolute privilege to be appointed to the Shadow Cabinet. As you said earlier, I had served as a minister in DFID for 2 years, first under Kate Osmore and then Dan Carden. And now there are lots of cooperative MPs in the Shadow Cabinet, and I know we are all keen to work with the Co-op Party and its members. And I see that really as a two-way street. So you should be able to raise issues and concerns with us, and I hope that I'm able to use your knowledge, your experience and expertise going forward in my role. There are some areas, as mentioned already by Alice, such as fair trade, that the cooperative movement has really had a long history of championing. And as a Labour and cooperative MP, I'm proud to be part of that tradition. I've seen what a difference fair trade can make to some of the world's poorest people. And when we are thinking about trade, these are the people that we should be ensuring it protects and works for, rather than wilting to corporate interests. And it's the understanding of the links between what we do in the UK and what happens in other parts of the world, which we need to build and strengthen going forward. Just as a really quick brief history, for those who don't know, the Department for International Development was created by Labour in 1997, and it has a primary focus of tackling extreme poverty. In recent years, the government have increasingly, though, used the aid budget to prop up other government departments with at best tenuous links to development objectives. The impacts on the world's poorest, of course, cuts across the different briefs, and that's why it's so important that we work very closely with the Foreign Office, Defence and Trade teams in the international teams, for example, as the government, especially the government is currently negotiating trade deals. They could push for ones that require deregulation, for example, or weaken the state. Because of course, in order to tackle intense poverty and foster equality, we should instead push for those trade deals to act as positive incentives to those that really need them. In terms of our current priorities, of course, I mean, COVID-19 is the current focus for myself and the team at the moment. What the pandemic has actually highlighted is the sad truth that our world is incredibly unequal. In the global south, families are crowded into refugee camps and slum settlements, and those in countries with weak health systems, as Alice has also mentioned, are at risk of being forgotten altogether. And with the economic fallout in this crisis projected to see up to 500 million people pushed into poverty, the longer lasting impact is not going to be equal either. And part of the course of this is the lack of global leadership that we've seen, with the United Nations Security Council failing to agree a global ceasefire, which would of course allow attention and resources to be focused on overcoming COVID-19 and real risks. Instead, what we will see is there'll be a scramble for resources to procure whatever equipment countries can for themselves, rather than working together to increase the global supply. So I want to reach out really to a wide range of actors, and I really encourage and empower local actors, because we know resources are going to take far too long to actually get to the people on the ground who need it. I think that was one of the lessons from Ebola, actually. Some countries didn't receive actually the payment for over a year after the sort of pandemic. So one of my first acts as Shadow International Development Secretary was to reach out to the international development sector with a call for evidence from activists, not just from individuals and INGOs, but trade unions, large and small NGOs, global movements, really to get a better understanding of the impact of COVID-19. And I think it's really important that myself and the Shadow team, we continue these relationships to work with all the actors I've mentioned, because we don't want to dictate policy and interventions. We want to listen. We want to hear from those that are engaged and on the ground. I think for us, though, in the Labour and cooperative movement, I think we have a real opportunity in setting out what the world could be like post-COVID-19. And I think that internationalism, our values of internationalism, solidarity, of understanding what weak health systems mean for many of the world's poorest. And I think here is a real opportunity to be advocating for universal healthcare. Whilst the multilateral system around global funds and Gavi are doing some great work, because we know vaccines are really important around malaria, TB, AIDS, of course, but it doesn't really invest in universal health coverage, as this pandemic has highlighted in terms of the inequalities that we are seeing. So our long-term policy formation is going to be about engaging with everybody that we possibly can. I've mentioned making sure that we are absolutely using this opportunity to make real change and rethink what aid and development could look like. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'll unmute both of you, so you're ready and able to answer questions. And would people like to put hands up or let me know if you'd like to ask a question? I've got a couple that have been messaged over. Pete Weston had a question, so I'm going to unmute you first, if that's okay, Pete.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, thank you.
Lovely. Hello.
Hello. My name's Pete Weston. I'm Secretary of the Kettering and Wellingborough branch of the Co-op Party. And I'm very interested to see how future trade deals with the Europe, the USA and the rest of the world may affect fair trade, and how can we safeguard that fair trade is included in all those trade deals so that we don't disadvantage it.
Great, thank you very much. I will put you back on mute. I've got Stirling Smith next.
Right, okay, you unmuted me, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question's really about party policy, Labour Party shadow cabinet policy on the role of cooperatives in international development. There are 280 million people employed by cooperatives. 12% of the world's population are members of cooperatives. I used to look at the Cooperative College, a lot of engagement with DFID then, before 2010. So really it's about mainstreaming cooperative development, which is of course usually very sustainable, into development practice. I think that's very important. I'd like to know what Preet and the team are doing to develop that.
Fabulous. And Andrew Jenkins, you should be, should be unmuted now. There we are.
Okay,
Hello.
can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got a question for Preet and then a couple of quick ones for Alice, if that's okay.
So I'll make them quick.
Very quick, yeah. The first one is, I worked in Bangladesh a long time, and I actually had an encounter with Rory Stewart before he became Secretary of State, which was really interesting. And he, during the brief time he was there, he gave a very strong emphasis on adaptation and mitigation of climate change, and that was a major focus of policy at that time. It seems to have been dropped a bit in the meantime. Do you think there are ways of encouraging the government to go back in that direction, and for DFID to get back to focusing on that? Although I do think quite a lot of the work that DFID's doing that I'm in contact with at the moment is still quite positive. But I thought that was a really good focus. So that's my first question. Second question is for Alice. The information that you gave about helping the fair trade suppliers was really interesting. I belong to 2 local cooperative societies because I live on a boundary, and there's one in one village and one in the next, and they're different societies. And we're getting a lot of information about how, by contributing our dividend payments and stuff, we're helping local efforts and local charities and local kind of mobilization. But we haven't heard anything about that through the mechanisms which are sent out to members. And I think quite a lot of members are very interested in fair trade. And if we're doing that kind of thing, and the co-op is helping, I think it would be helpful if the societies would add a little bit about their international efforts to their local efforts, which they're informing us about quite a lot. And finally, I think for a long time I've been thinking, because I worked in Bangladesh for a long time, and it's a big producer of jute, and we're all concerned now about packaging and improving with renewable packaging and different forms of packaging, getting rid of plastic. Is there a scope for fair trade to move, in addition to food items, to move into things like jute and other fibers, which could be used for more renewable packaging? Is that an area that is being explored or could be explored? Thank you.
Great. So if I unmute you first, Preet, is that okay? Great. Again, I think it might be one that you need to do from your end. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
There we are.
Yeah, so thank you so much for those questions. On the first question, I think, look, the role of cooperatives is really, really important, and you've got to be part of the Rebuilding Better Back process. And, I think this is the first kind of initial conversation we've had, and I think it's really important that we continue that conversation, because there's a real risk that the government wants to dismantle DFID. We've seen that the integrated review has been paused, FCO ministers and DFID ministers in the way that the government has structured it. So there's a real danger and a risk in terms of actually making sure that we protect DFID. And of course, with money being spent, 30% of DFID's budget being spent by other departments, the lack of transparency. Only 3 of them have managed to achieve good in terms of being able to, in terms of aid effectiveness and expenditure. So I think, you know, I want to continue working with you to look at actually how do we build this cooperative movement with the members across the globe. And of course, we've got to build that coalition of support of why an independent DFID. But actually, as we've talked about, we're going to have a much more unequal world post-COVID-19. So actually, what are the things that we can do together? How do we ensure that we are giving more power and engaging civil society, community groups, especially women's rights groups as well, that are at the forefront of some of this? So yes, no, thank you for that. In terms of, I mean, climate justice, I mean, absolutely important. In the Wealth of the Many document that we put out, we really specified how important it is, and to actually identify additional ODA money so that it's not taken out from the current ODA spend around climate justice and the things that we can tackle, but actually pushing the CDC to do a lot more in terms of a greener economy and what jobs could look like across especially the global south. But of course, what we've seen is that despite the government telling us that they're not, you know, investing in fossil fuel projects, the fact of the matter is they still continue to do that. And we've been continuously pressing that, and we get the same rhetoric. And that's something that we are continually going to expose, and we've been holding them to account on that. Yeah. And we will continue to keep pressing on that. So I think the engagement going forward, though, is going to be really essential, and making sure that we have a mechanism that cooperative members, especially in the UK, can feel that they are part of the, you know, a real support to us on the shadow DFID team as well. But also, how do we push forward some of the campaigns and some of the issues that you think are important, not just here in the UK, but actually could benefit those in the global south and further afield. So I look forward to continuing that conversation and making sure we build those relationships so that we can adequately do that together.
Great. And Alice, there were a couple of questions there that I think it would be great to get your views on. How we can get sort of, you know, the co-op movement and co-op stores invest money in communities. How can we help make sure that they are investing money in communities beyond our backyard? There was a question around trade and how we can embed fair trade in our trade agreements, and what your views are on that. And then I guess around climate change and thoughts around things like sustainable packaging. So quite varied.
Yes, and they're really great questions, so thank you for those. I wanted to just touch on the future trade deals first. This is something that we are actively working on. So part of my role here at Fairtrade is to lead on Fairtrade's sort of trade policy response. So that's something I'm very engaged on and continue to be engaged on. While, you know, quite clearly at the moment, a lot of our work at Fairtrade is on the COVID response. We absolutely see the future trade policy as being integral to that response and integral to recovery. So we are continuing to advocate and call on the government to ensure that, particularly when it comes to the end of this year, that there is not a cliff edge for developing countries and for a lot of the fair trade producers that we work with. So currently, what we're particularly concerned about at the moment is that there are several countries who have deals in place with the EU that have not been rolled over. So they haven't agreed for those to be continued. And those, just sort of very briefly, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon and Kenya. And I've already mentioned today that Kenya has been severely impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. So if at the end of this year we see Kenya falling off a cliff edge and losing a lot of the preferences that it currently enjoys in trading with the UK, the impact on producers and workers will be huge and will really affect their ability to recover. So we're continuing to work on safeguarding producers and workers in future trade deals, and that's something that I'm working on very closely, and we'll be doing a lot more work in Parliament on that in the coming weeks and months as well. On the question of investing in communities beyond our backyard, I take the point that I think Andrew, you were saying that that they haven't heard about some of the impacts that investment has been making on the ground. So it's something that I'll be feeding back to our teams. But I mean, we hugely rely on the support of fair trade supporters, like everyone in the Co-op Party, and it's obviously now there is a lot that needs to be done, but I think this needs to be done with not just, I mean, there's a huge amount of government response that needs to take place, and businesses as well, but it's communities, and I think, as Preet said, this is about solidarity and the ideas of internationalism and solidarity, and so consumers will be a key part of that, and we're keen to make sure that we can find a way that consumers are able to support with that response, and making sure that farmers and producers are supported throughout the crisis. And finally, to Andrew's question on climate and looking at packaging. So yes, in brief, that is a discussion that we're having. It's something we're thinking about at Fairtrade. As a whole organisation, we are absolutely clear that the climate response needs to be a key part of everything that we do in the future, and everything to do with the response to COVID-19 as well. We are looking in terms of our policy response, in terms of how we would like to see the government responding in a way that supports developing country farmers and producers, but helps them to adapt to climate change and to mitigate against its worst impacts, and looking at how we can build that sustainable and fair trading system that also supports farmers and workers as well, so that they're not forgotten about as we begin to think about this building back better and the vision of the world that we want to see. So I hope that answers your questions, and as just to kind of reiterate as well, that we really value the support that we get from the Co-operative Party, and I look forward to continuing to engage with all the members here, and thank you for your continued support of Fairtrade. It is really important now more than ever.
No, it's great. We've had lots of sort of suggestions and ideas in the chat while you've been talking, both of you, around how we can continue that support. So Malcolm Wallace, who you'll spot the amazing Fairtrade background on his Zoom picture, is urging people to add Fairtrade logos or a message to purchase Fairtrade goods in their email signatures. We got a suggestion from David Breed, who I know has been very active at organising his local branch via Zoom, around getting members to be continually meeting and discussing fair trade and feeding back how we can support your work better. So lots of really great plans, and maybe we'll put together some materials so you can go and have those conversations locally.
Yes, absolutely.
Are there any more questions? I've got a couple in the chat, but now's your chance to put your hands up as well. And in the meantime, I had a question from Frank around, I think it's sort of looking at some of the issues around global food security. Frank, I've unmuted you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Frank Ellis. Yeah, I mean, it concerns me both in the third world. If people are ill, if people can't get out and collect food. We're eating last year's harvest now. How are we going to manage if we don't get our own harvest in and we don't get the harvest we rely on in the third world?
Great, thank you. So if we jump into a big question around food security, I don't know, Alice, if that's something that's hit your desk.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that this crisis has revealed is how interrelated all of this is. So, and I think I mentioned in my intervention, maybe it was lost, but there's this key figure that 10 to 15% of the overseas food imports comes from developing countries. So absolutely what we're seeing is the needs of farmers and workers and the need to support them is absolutely vital to our own food security. And we now have this, I think, a real realization of that shared vulnerability and that shared responsibility that we have to support those in our supply chain, and supporting farmers and workers now, and and as I mentioned, that immediate public health and the supporting of livelihoods that needs to happen now. In the long term, that's going to enable us to build back a more resilient and a more secure food supply chain here in the UK. So absolutely both of the needs of developing country producers and food security here, this crisis has really revealed how linked they are.
Yeah.
Preet, I'd imagine food security is quite high up on the list of concerns that you and colleagues will be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, there was the World Food Programme report out yesterday, which showed the potential damage and increase in food security. And of course, we've got to make sure that supply chains continue while this is happening. And I think it was really quite stark when I read some of the statistics and the data actually within that report. It was saying 1 in 9 people is hungry, or 820 million people worldwide. So while 1 in 3 is overweight or obese, an increasing number of countries have got the double burden, of course, of malnutrition, obesity, and other diet-related diseases, whether it's diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, or cancer that they're dealing with. So yeah, I mean, this is a real issue because, of course, if you don't have nutrition, you have weaker immune systems, and therefore you are going to be much more at risk, especially from the COVID-19 pandemic. So food security is a real big issue. I think, it was quite shocking for me, though, to see the World Food Programme use words such as famine. I think this is a word we haven't heard for quite a long time. I don't think it's been used lightly. It's not to scaremonger. It's the reality that actually people might die from hunger as opposed to dying before they die from COVID-19. And I think that's really concerning.
Absolutely. Well, that's a slightly downbeat note to finish on. I've got one more question. So Norman, I'm hoping that it's going to be one that helps think about a positive future as well.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very general question. I'd really like to know to what extent do you think fair trade makes an impact within the overall international trade scene? What sort of percentage of international trade are we talking about? How has fair trade grown in the number of producers that it supports over the years? Is it still growing, and what are their plans for the future? Do you have an aim to, I suppose ideally you would like to see 100% coverage, but that's possibly out of the question. So really looking at fair trade within the scene of overall world trade, how does it fit in?
Great, thanks. And we also had a query on PPE in the chat saying, are PPE providers, are there PPE providers who are a fair trade cotton or cooperative? So I don't know what the score is on that front and whether that could help us too, but I'll hand over to Alice and Preet.
I don't think fair trade is just a niche interest. I think it shows us that there is a way of doing trade in a way that treats people as people, and I think that's really important. I think it'd be good to hear from Anna if she thinks that Alice, if she thinks that it's making the impact, because of course there is a huge issue around Ghana. The cocoa industry is facing something like $1 billion fall in revenues. So there's some real issues that need tackling. Thanks.
Yep. Yes, thank you, Preet. I mean, I absolutely think that the impact that we're seeing now has revealed why fair trade is so important, and I think one of the things that we are seeing, and I think there's growing evidence for this, is that actually fair trade systems which have the use of that premium may be actually better able to face this crisis and maybe be better able to recover from the crisis, because they are able to have had that investment and able to invest in their communities. So absolutely, I think fair trade now is going to become, and rightly so, more and more relevant. And we are obviously very keen here at Fairtrade to continue to make the case for why Fairtrade is so important. I mean, we've been making the case for Fairtrade for 25 or 26 years now, and this crisis has revealed just how important that is, and I think we are seeing that. And again, as I mentioned, I think, you know, we're also seeing that Fairtrade businesses have responded in a way in this crisis which has been really positive. So they have been among the first to understand that they need to support vulnerable producers in their supply chain. I think it was Waitrose who was one of the first to make an official announcement, but so many businesses who were on that sort of ethical journey have been very quick to support. So I think you can see all the way through from the kind of the producers that have been able to invest in their community, from the businesses that are involved in the fair trade system, and then to the consumers who are continuing to support. And I absolutely love all of the backgrounds on the call. This is fantastic. So you can see the whole way through the fair trade, the whole way through the fair trade system, how it's responding to this crisis and how it can help to support. So absolutely, I see it continuing to be incredibly important. Just quickly on the PPE providers of fair trade cotton, I know on the garment industry, because and I'm sure that many members will be aware, it's been huge, and we've seen huge job losses and order cancellations, and it's been a very, very difficult and will continue to be a very difficult time for the garment industry. And I don't know if there are particular fair trade workers that have been re-geared towards PPE, but that's something that I will certainly be following up with our supply chain team to see if that's something that's been happening. So thank you for that point.
So I think I will wrap it up there, so you've got time for a sandwich before you go back to work. But thank you so much. We've had over 80 of you on the call today, which is fantastic. So a huge thank you to Alice and Preet for a really informative discussion. Frank, David and others, thank you for your virtual round of applause. You can use the reactions button at the bottom if you want, or the sort of time cooperative movement time-honoured way of silent clapping. But no, thank you so much, Alice and Preet. I'm a bit hit and miss with following up on some of these, but there have been particular things here I'd love to be able to circulate to you to let you know a bit more detail about some of the areas that Preet and Alice talked about. As I mentioned, Alice has written a blog for us, so I'll be sending that out to everybody who signed up. Preet actually did a blog for us just when she first became Shadow Minister, talking about the importance of cooperatives in international development policy. So I will dig that out of our archives and include that as well, so you can see that we absolutely have cooperative parliamentarians championing our values in their roles and taking it forward into their new roles as well. And then there are a few sort of thoughts and suggestions around how individuals can take action. So I'll compile them from the chat and send them round too, because I think it's so important that we're all doing what we can to be ethical consumers, to champion fair trade and the principles of the co-op movement in all the choices that we're making every day. So thank you for lots of those suggestions as well. So I will leave you all to your Wednesdays. Councillors on this call, I might see you again at 6 p.m. and then next week we will be joined, I think we have a Wales theme for our lunchtime call next Wednesday, so we'll be looking at some of the differences in approach in Wales, hearing from the Wales Cooperative Centre around some of the innovative work they've been doing around the role of cooperatives in this crisis and how we rebuild out of this crisis in a cooperative way. So join us, it should be really interesting. And in the meantime, stay at home and look after yourself and try and stay sane. Thank you very much, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you.